well, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, Episode 5, Season 2. So, one of the things I love most about doing this podcast is discovering new and different ways to not till the soil. Different techniques, different cover materials, and today is definitely one of those episodes where we kind of do both. I got on the phone with Deb Habib and Baruch of Seeds of Solidarity to talk about their use of cardboard on a relatively substantial growing area. They use it for Insta-gardens in this really cool way. They're off-grid, and we talk about some of the challenges there, but also a lot of the rewards with that. And we talk about their book of essays called Making Love While Farming, which you should check out. Such a rewarding and rich conversation. It is not always easy to farm full-time and run a podcast. Okay, it's literally never easy, but it is getting to have and share conversations like this that make it absolutely worth it. 100%. But before we dive into that conversation, speaking of interesting growing methods, don't forget that we will be hosting an event near San Diego this upcoming February with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food and Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right. Jared and Stephen are both doing really interesting work in the realm of no-till, and Jared is even doing several acres in lasagna-style beds on a production scale. Yeah, it's super cool. We are super excited about it, and we hope to see you there. Go to no-tillgrowers.com for more info. It's under the Events tab, and we'll put the link in the show notes. And Patreon members get a discount. Patreon.com/FarmerJesse. Just saying. Anyway, enough from me. Let's get to our amazing interview with Deb Habib and Baruch of Seeds of Solidarity. Deb Habib, Baruch, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to have you on. Can you all start, just give us a little bit of a rundown of what Seeds of Solidarity is? It seems like, from what I can find about your farm, it seems like just a lot more than a farm.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'll start, and then Rick can jump in here. So we do have two kind of philosophically and land-connected entities. One is Seeds of Solidarity Farm, which is our family farm, and the other is Seeds of Solidarity Education Center, which is a nonprofit organization we founded about 2 decades ago. And, you know, the thing that's common about them both is they're really both about growing food and also teaching people to grow food. So particularly through the nonprofit organization, we run a number of programs to help build food resilience and food justice in the region where we live, which is the North Quabbin area of western central Massachusetts. It's somewhat rural, and mostly there's a lot of people who struggle in our community. It's one of the most economically challenged regions of Massachusetts, so the need, to really grow food is critical everywhere, and quite critical, for when people don't have food. So we've worked through our educational programs a lot with teenagers in our community. We've worked with women who run family child care centers to help establish small no-till raised garden beds there so that they can feed the kids and the families there. We teach gardening at our county jail to men and women who are incarcerated. We've worked a lot over the years with schools, helping to establish school garden programs and related farm-to-school initiatives. And we also, which we can talk more about, with our neighbors, put on a large festival called the North Quabbin Garlic and Arts Festival that, over 2 decades has grown in many wonderful ways. But really at the heart of our educational programs is teaching people to grow food. And in fact, our mantra, our slogan is grow food everywhere. And, all of that, again, is how do we use our local resources? How do we practice no-till and regenerative ways of growing food in ways that are sacred and healthy and also build community? So that is sort of the piece in addition to the farm that, you'll hear more about, or love to share more about the farm methods as well.
Yeah, that's great. And then talk maybe a little bit about the farm side. What size of acreage are you working with there? And then kind of what's in cultivation, that sort of thing?
Great question. So I think a really important piece to begin with is the image. It was a forest, and I think that's an important piece. And we're seeing more articles in Growing for Market about folks turning forest into agricultural land. And I think why that's important is in the old days, we're looking for land. We're looking for river bottom land. Now we're getting 100-year floods 3 years in a row. So that's out of the picture. Now with genetically modified drift in farmland communities, if you buy land near farms, that's a real possibility. Back in the day, it used to just be, pesticide drift. Now it's a lot worse than that. And, the price of land is out of control if you're trying to compete with Home Depot or Walmart. So our model is how can we grow in non-agricultural areas? And I think that's really the key. So when you imagine this place, it's basically a former forest that we basically reclaimed back into agriculture. And there was actually a couple fields that were actually last used during the Civil War era that was worked back then. So it's a kind of reclaiming land. So back in the day, when we first got on the land, maybe been here about 20 years, we were doing a lot more production, and we're probably doing 2.5 acres. Now we've shrunk it down and really condensed it, but most of it's very intensive in greenhouses and growing specialty greens, garlic for the festival, and crops like native corn.
Another piece about where we live, Jesse, is that this area is called the North Quabbin, and the Quabbin Valley had 4 towns in an agricultural area and, good soil, and that was actually taken in the Depression era by eminent domain by Boston, which is about 80 miles to our east. And so most of the good land was taken out of production, and, by filling it with water to create a reservoir for the urban areas. So, that really, again, shifted the ability. And so, so having to be creative not only in rural areas, but also, of course, in urban areas is increasingly important. So we're all closer to the source of our food supply, and we're able to reclaim land. And that's why, we were, as Rick was saying, we kind of had to start using no-till methods. He had a farm prior to that in New York State that was, a larger organic tractors, using tractors and so forth on, 20 acres or whatever, right, Rick? But, but we really had to say, well, there's not really agricultural land to till down into, so we kind of had to start from the ground up, literally, with no-till methods and build the soil. So it was a necessity, and it's also been a blessing in a lot of ways because we've been able to really, transform log clearing into some really beautiful, fertile land and teach others in rural, suburban, and urban areas how to do the same.
And I love hearing that. I'd like to hear a little bit get into some technical stuff real quick, just about how you went about clearing your garden space. How did you turn that from a forest into garden space?
That's a great question. Well, for the greenhouses, we used equipment, to clear out the trees. And then in that case, the most inexpensive thing to use to level the land, we actually brought in sand, and then we just bring in, raw compost, raw manure, and then we topped it with compost. That's for the greenhouses, and we would put up 30 by 96 foot greenhouses every other year. And so that was for the greenhouses, but for the land, we did really the cardboard method back then. That's all we knew about, really. And we basically put down, cardboard, get some raw manure, not, very broken down, and then top it with some really good compost. And we had what we call Insta-beds. And then, we were sowing salad greens because my mindset was, if I'm going to compete with California, that's the competition, what can you really tell the difference? And it's really about salad greens, that thing. So we were able to instantly turn it into a farm, doing arugula, salad mix, and in 3 weeks, we're off and selling to the nicest restaurants in this area.
One more thing about how we created sort of transformed the land from an area that had been logged to a farm. And right now when I look out of our farm, of our house window, and we build all the houses and farm structures on here ourselves too, but as I look out, I do see beautiful forest on the edge of our sort of open areas. And so, all the trees, being in New England, we were able to do it thoughtfully, and all the wood we were able to have milled and use in our buildings and use for firewood, and also just, I think it created a really nice edge environment too. So there's a lot of rich ecosystem that happens at the edges of the farmland and the forest for lots of birds and other good creatures.
Yeah, I've noticed that some of our best garden space, and this has gone for several gardens that we've worked in, have been what's closer to the woods. And I often wonder what's happening below ground and what's happening above ground, maybe that light diffusion a little bit. Yeah, I've always wondered why that is. But that's great. I mean, it is nice to have those around. I think having the combination of clear and forest it has a lot of benefits in terms of ecology.
Right,
Definitely.
and didn't want your listeners to envision some giant clear-cut area, because it's remained a really rich, diverse ecosystem in doing that.
I would say the biggest thing is basically been the worms. I mean, that has been our greatest ally. I mean, this is very acidic land, forest. The mountain laurel is an indicator of acid soil, and we've never actually added lime. We've actually never added bag fertilizer, and it's really been the worms and the cardboard, them teaming up together to actually produce, really beautiful, land where actually a lot of the land I could put my hand up to my elbow into, over, 20 years of building it up. So, yeah. Wow,
that's really incredible. Can you talk a little bit about how that cardboard method works? I mean, you kind of described it. Mm-hmm. Has it evolved from putting down cardboard and then just adding kind of a raw layer of manure on top?
Yeah, we have three different methods. Like if somebody just has sod, backyard, front yard, and you want to plant like tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, what we do is you lay down the cardboard, always overlap it a few inches, and then you cut out holes out of the cardboard, shovel out the actual sod, put in finished compost, put in your tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, and then put like a straw, hay, grass clippings on top of the cardboard. That's one instant garden. And another instant garden would be where you actually put compost below the cardboard, put the cardboard down, put some hay, and use a dibbler to dibble crops that are closer together, like kale, collards, chard. That's what basically we tell people. And another third instant technique is where you actually put down the cardboard and you put, maybe 4 inches of finished compost on top for scatter sowing seeds, for salad mix and stuff. But basically what we've done here on the land here, the early years we had to bring in compost because, there was no soil. And then we would, every year put cardboard on top and plant through the cardboard. And at this point, a lot of the beds, I'm reducing the amount of compost. And actually, the cardboard is basically creating all the fertility from the worm castings. And so basically the cardboard is your tiller, because you don't have to till. It's your moisture control. It's your fertilizer. And it's your weed control. So it's phenomenal stuff. And so what's going after now is, at this stage of the game, it's called the no-till self-sustaining cardboard method. So the idea is that just by adding cardboard every year, that is the fertilizer.
So where did that come from? Like when you say that was kind of all you knew, where did that idea for using cardboard in this way come from?
It's funny you should ask. It really, people ask that question, and having the farm in upstate New York uses a lot of plastic, and so I knew how plastic worked. It just kind of came to me. We were living at Deb's family's house, and we just started playing with it. And then when we moved on the land here, that's really kind of okay. We would drive by this food co-op as we were building our house here, and we just filled the pickup truck, and we just spread it down. Oh, let's hope this works. And it's amazing. Basically what happens is the cardboard has hide glue in it, and it has a lot of protein in it. And so the worms go nuts, and they're attracted to it. And we call it the worm's perfect singles bar, because worms want to produce above ground, but the predators are the birds. And as you know, cardboard gets very mucousy, so it's the absolute perfect environment for the worms. And yeah, the worms are phenomenal. And I think the real piece about, opening, like the piece you said a minute ago, it's like we're very above ground creatures, but we need to be really taking stock of what's going below. And for example, like with worms, 1 acre of land, if you have enough worms, will produce 150 tons per year of compost, worm castings. It's phenomenal.
Wow.
Yeah, they're got that from the Amy Stewart's book.
And we watched it. Like, obviously, we watched it for the first year. We kept watching it, and then just kept observing really the level of life in the soil ecosystem, and that's only what we could see. The worms and the mycorrhizal fungi and the worm castings, and then knowing also, then Rick especially started doing more and more research on what those relationships were, and learning how the worm slime feeds a lot of the microbes in the soil, and also thinking about the possibility or the capacity of the pH to change because of all that microbial and worm activity. So we watched it, and the abundance of life just led us to more and more realization that this is just a really great technique. And Rick, how much can you put, like in the Ford F-350, how much cardboard?
Yeah, I can do an area about 35 feet wide by 100 feet long, so it's basically like a mini farm with one truckload, so it's impressive.
Okay, so where are you sourcing that cardboard? I think that's kind of a big question for me, because I've tried to source it from a few places. But
the best furniture, even tire places, believe it or not, they get a lot of stuff in boxes, appliance, bicycle stores. But basically, worm farms shred up cardboard. That's what they feed the worms. So it's kind of known that cardboard and worms. So what we always tell people who visit here is the perfect worm food is cardboard, and the perfect plant food is worm poop, worm casting. And the numbers from worms are phenomenal. Basically, everything they eat comes out 5 to 10 times richer, which is pretty mind-blowing.
And one thing for people to keep in mind, if you're trying this at home or on your farm, is just go for the plain brown corrugated cardboard with, not a lot of color on it, just plain black. There are soy-based inks, and, with all the recycling having kicked in, those products need to be the materials that go into the cardboard paper, obviously, and like Rick mentioned, the hide glue and the soy-based inks, are fairly non-toxic. But, we encourage people to stay away from highly colored stuff, and also wax boxes. The wax will break down, but for produce boxes, as folks know, they might be, if they're not organic especially, they might be sprayed with like a post-harvest pesticide or something. So just sticking with the plain corrugated cardboard. And, it's been a nice way to build relationships, too, because like the furniture companies, for example, in the area, there aren't many, but there are some where there aren't that many businesses around here, but they need to get rid of it. And so if they can get rid of it in a way that doesn't cost them a lot of money to get rid of, that's kind of a blessing for them, too. So at times we've had folks just say, hey, I have a truckload full, can I bring it over there? And other times Rick needs to go out and search some out.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to kind of just dive into this a little bit more with the technical aspect of the cardboard, because one thing that I found, we've been experimenting with cardboard here or there. We do a lot of different trials on our farm, but that's what I'm really interested in for the reasons you've stated. But I often find the tape. Is there a trick to getting the tape off efficiently, or what are some thoughts on that?
Well, there's two schools. My school, we put down so much, I don't even consider it. Deb kind of tells me to, hey, take the tape off, but I never take the tape off. And then when it's all said and done, it breaks down. There's some tape around. I mean, it really.
Right, and then he'll rake it off. So then basically, what's kind of cool about leaving the tape on is that then you're like, wow, that cardboard from 4 or 6 or 8 months ago, depending on the season, is gone. It's been consumed, and all that's left is the tape. Break it off. Yeah, for me, especially in smaller areas, I like to just kind of quickly strip it off. But on a large scale, it does take time to do that. So.
Right, that's an important consideration. And I kind of think, I didn't look this up before you all may know, but then in organic certification, you have to remove the tape, I think, right? Hey, you all, real quick. I checked in on the basics of cardboard and USDA organic certification, and you will have to check with your certifier, but this is what the rules say. From the USDA, quote, cardboard is considered to be a type of paper and therefore must be made from recycled materials. The cardboard cannot be printed with glossy or color inks. In addition, the cardboard must not be waxed or have been treated with fungicide, end quote. And then ATRA did some research on the different substances that go into making cardboard, glues and such. And they basically found that as long as it's brown corrugated cardboard, it's relatively benign, and that's their word, benign. And then they went on to say, using cardboard, quote, many people can fulfill their mulching needs without the use of riskier materials, end quote. Hope that helps. All right, back to the interview.
We could have a long conversation about the various ways organic certification has gone, right?
Right. No. Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
if you know that to be true, then that would be advised. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
sure.
they're allowing so much crap in with organic certification in other ways, right?
Yeah, being organically certified, I can confirm that it's that it can be a little frustrating.
Yeah.
So in terms of laying it down, another thing I'm kind of curious about is laying it down and not losing it to the wind. What is the sort of process of just actually getting it onto the soil?
Perfect. Yeah, it's great if you have a bunch of people, and it's really a community event. People love it. But basically, if you can have a hose nearby, that's perfect. Lay it down, hose. And once it gets a little moist, you're good to go. But the key is you always have to keep it covered because that really keeps the moisture, and that's when the worms go nuts. So I think that's key. If you can moisten it as you're laying it down, mulch, wood chips, you're definitely. And what I've actually started to do recently is I can get from a horse farm near here, like a big, 10-yard truck for like $40. And it's high in wood shavings, but it has a little, nitrogen left in it. But the point is that it's much heavier and it's much cheaper. So then putting down hay, as we know, that gets a little pricey. But if you can get this kind of rough compost, that's the best because it will definitely, it's not blowing anywhere.
Yeah, so...
And covering it as you go. Like, you don't want to lay down a whole bunch and then, go have lunch or something, when a wind picks up. You definitely want to cover it with whatever you're using, like Rick said, the mulch, wood chips that'll then not get mixed into your soil but stay on top. If people live near the coast and they have, eelgrass or seaweed, if you've got a source of municipal rotted, like leaf mulch or rotted leaves that you might have access to, but kind of covering as you layer so that it does stay covered and doesn't just turn into a big pile of dominoes going down if a wind picks up.
And then you're only really adding another layer every year, or is it more than a year? Or
no, just once a year. I just keep putting it down. So basically, for transplants, cardboard's the ticket. Okay. But if I need bare soil for cover crops or scatter sow seeds or direct seeding, I use the silage tarps. But whenever I'm going to put down, if I'm going to put transplants, I go through cardboard. So I'm just always putting down cardboard. Yeah, any time of the year. And the nice thing, what we're seeing with the cardboards with this erratic weather, is a couple of years ago we had major droughts here, and we had a group out, and we grow a lot of native corns. Right below the cardboard, it was moist in a drought, and the worms were there. And I said, look, you can go a few towns over, Hadley, Loam, it's some of the best soil in the country. There's no moisture, and there are no worms. And so what I see about plants is plants are like humans. They like in moderation. And so by keeping it covered, it's, the soil's moderated. It's, nice and moist for the plants. Versus if you have bare soil, the plants are going up and down with the crazy weather. Too dry, too wet, and especially this has been a crazy summer already. We have a lot of moisture, now it's dry. The cardboard really keeps the soil moderated, and that's what plants want.
Yeah, that's great, and it's so interesting to think about doing this in those two different methods. One, the direct seeding with the tarp. Can you talk a little bit about how you utilize those silage tarps?
Well, that's a great one because that's an example something went wrong and you had to figure it out. So we get this great chicken compost. That's the finished stuff we use on the top layer. Wonderful stuff. And 1 year, as in day I was planting 300-foot beds a week. And I planted them, and I thought it was lamb's quarters. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And so I had beds of lamb's quarters, and somehow, and it really made me think about how things happen, It happens, but somehow either at the compost farm or at our place, it got inundated with lamb's quarters. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? So I looked up in the farm tech catalog, and that's how I really got tuned into silage tarps. What's interesting is that that kind of, I had to kill this stuff, this lamb's quarter. So kind of, I learned from that. And what's interesting, I work with this whole no-till group out of Cornell, and I mentioned this whole thing called occultation using silage tarps. They looked at me like I was crazy. And I got that word from Jean Martin. So he, at the same time, he and I were basically getting into this stuff, me out of necessity. So basically I figured, this stuff's pretty interesting. And basically whenever I need bare ground, like in the greenhouses, I use the tarps. And guaranteed, the best, I've been farming for 30 years, the best tilth you'll ever get to get good ground is the silage tarps. And they're phenomenal. It just makes it breaks down all that organic matter into gorgeous tilth. And so the big thing I'm really trying to get farmers to think about is if only using it at the beginning of the season, just because these farmers they'll have the best equipment in the world, but they can't get on the land because it's so darn wet, or they have cover crops, which are wonderful, but they're expecting to till in their cover crops and wait a period of time for that cover crop to break down, and by that point, the season's basically over. So if you really want to, get on the ground early, do the cover crop, cover them with tarps, and you're not, wasting your time waiting for the ground to dry up. So the beautiful thing about the no-till, it makes you more creative in thinking, and you're just that much more efficient. And I think that's why a lot of people are getting turned on the whole no-till. The speed at which you can farm, basically. The efficiency, I should say, yeah.
Hey, you all, just jumping in here real quick to let you know that today's show is brought to you by Farmers Web.
Farmers Web software makes it easier for your farm to manage working with your buyers. By lessening the administrative load and increasing efficiency, Farmers Web helps you save time, reduce errors, and work with more buyers overall. Our free account includes features to manage your real-time and coming-soon product availability, and tools to create your own availability calendar to inform buyers of the seasonality of your products. The free account also includes access to the Farmers Web Guide to Working with Wholesale Buyers, which offers pro tips and best practices on how to work with restaurants, schools, and other similar buyers. A 1-month free trial is available of the paid account, which includes features to manage your customers and orders, give select buyers special pricing and payment terms, track your buyers' payments, send invoices, keep detailed sales records, and much more. You can even manage orders for buyers who don't place them online. Access a demo video and learn more at farmersweb.com.
Big thanks to Farmers Web. Back to the interview.
The thing you said about the tarping, Rick, and using the silage tarps is that, if you've got land covered, you're working in another field, whatever, and maybe you can't get the cover crop in that week, it's okay. The biomass is being broken down under the tarps, and it reduces some stress, right? Because you can kind of wait a little longer than you might otherwise, and then you can kind of then you get to it, but it helps reduce the stress of having to get on that land immediately before other things grow.
Well, that's our whole thing. It's like the bane of the so-called farmer is like they're anxious about tilling. I got to till the land, and then they're anxious that their land's been opened up and they got to do something. So it's like, these type A farmers in this constant level of stress. And our whole thing is having our land covered either under cardboard, cover crops, or silage tarps. So it's kind of like, we can't depend on type A people to grow our food. I mean, we need everyone growing food, so we got to figure out ways to grow food that's inexpensive and efficient with, there's no labor pool out there. So it's a huge consideration.
So I'm curious, I kind of have a two-part question that's somewhat related. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you're marketing your food? And also, are you talking about these kind of things when you're marketing it?
That's a great question. Well, the whole thing is prana grown, life force, and it's an acronym for pesticide-free, all these different things, renewable fuel and all that. But yeah, definitely mentioned no-till, N in prana. But yeah, no-till, and because basically our whole thing is like as nature intended. Like we tell people, the biggest trees on the planet, redwoods, there's no little tiller going around. And, it's basically the first 12 inches of soil, everything is based on that, right? Everything lives because of that. And this whole tilling thing is just, Our whole thing, get a little more political is, the colonizer mentality, not looking at soil in a sacred way. It's like, oh, we'll figure this out. We'll just destroy it, and then we'll add what we want. It's very colonizer, chemical mindset. And I think, a lot of organic farmers have kind of followed in that path. It's like, and I think a lot of organic farmers are the worst culprits of tilling, especially vegetable farmers, getting multiple salad mix crops in and all that. So really want to get to those folks that are, really addicted to tilling. And it's a great, in Andrew Medford's book, there's a quote from USDA, basically says tilling's like all these, hurricane, tornado, all these things happening in the soil at once. It's just devastating.
So also to answer more of your question there, Jesse, about the marketing, it's been a progression, like Rick mentioned. So he in particular oversees the farm, and I run our nonprofit organization, but, we both share in the thinking through of both the farm and the educational programs. But I guess marketing-wise, over the 3 decades, things have shifted and changed, as we all know, through the buy local movement. So, for the first decade or whatever, Rick was part of a growers co-op in New York State and bringing stuff down to the New York City green markets. And then when we reestablished a farm in Massachusetts, that was like at the beginning of, the quote-unquote modern day, anyway, buy local movement. Of course, eating locally is, really the way it's been forever, ever since humans have been here and growing food or harvesting food. And then at that time, it was really bringing a focus on salad greens to lots and lots of restaurants and food co-ops, kind of a small CSA, and then, but that, it's a lot. It's a lot driving stuff all over the place, especially when you're not trying to use too many fossil fuels, even though we had a truck that was using biodiesel, vegetable-based fuel. But just for the kind of sanity and personal and being able to spend more time with the family. So Ricky built a farm stand at the top of our farm road and shrunk his accounts to be more local, and that's actually worked really well. We get a lot of people coming out to our farm stand for the greens, and the local accounts are wonderful, and some of those help feed people in need of fresh food, which is great, through a weekly subsidized share program. And then the Garlic and Arts Festival that we founded is where all of our garlic and a lot of other crops are sold, and we sell the garlic as seed planting garlic in kind of a value-added package so that people can grow their own garlic. So garlic is also one of our bigger crops.
It's interesting talking about kind of the renewable energy element of it. Are you all entirely off-grid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are. And I actually, just one more thing also about the no-till, and then I can say something about that. We love using the term no-till because there's some common language there, but I think also the question is, well, if it isn't till, then what is it? So, anything that has no in front of it. So I personally also like the language of regenerative is becoming a little bit more popularized, and people are using that. But I really like agroecological. I like the concept of agroecology because you're really naming that you're respecting and feeding the life in the soil and the ecology of the soil. So just throwing those terms in there. But yeah,
I think I'd like to talk about that for a second. I like that.
Oh, sure.
I think that's somebody. I talk about what is the definition of no-till a lot because people, ask me a lot, and I always tell them it's a really hard term to nail down, and it's a little bit divisive, especially like you said when you put that negative no in the middle in the front of it. And then somebody the other day mentioned regenerative market gardening, and I kind of like that as a great term as well. But yeah, it's funny. I think the terminology can be both helpful for people, for customers, consumers, but also kind of limiting in some ways. And it's interesting to hear how you all have evolved that.
Right. Well, and as we know, no-till isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily mean that you're not using herbicides, right? Because a lot of no-till practices do use herbicides. So I think the kinds of things we're all talking about here deserve a little bit of a different languaging and swing on things. So so I agree. I think regenerative market gardening is a great term, and I think more folks around the world use agroecology as a term, and I I personally think that's a really beautiful term too. We still need to explain to folks a bit what we mean by that, but maybe there's more language also that helps explain it.
Yeah, that's great.
So I think well, certainly being off the grid kind of goes hand in hand with our desire to utilize no-till / regenerative / agroecological practices on the farm, because those, of course, are not only about reducing reliance on fossil fuels, but also helping to keep the carbon stored in the soil where it belongs, rather than released into the atmosphere, CO2. So, and also, growing plants that are just going to keep pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere and back down into the soil where it belongs. I think for us, we met 35 years ago or so, working at a really amazing place called the New Alchemy Institute on Cape Cod in Massachussetts, and a very incredible uniting of science and visionary thinking, all focused on how we can provide for our food, energy, and shelter needs with minimal harm to the environment. And so that's where I think we got turned on to, more passive solar and active solar technologies. And again, this was in the early 80s, so things were really still evolving quite a lot. And then shortly after we married, or right after we married, in 94, we decided to take part in a pilgrimage that felt really important to us, an international interfaith pilgrimage that was 8 months long. It went from Auschwitz to Iraq, and it was part of the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II and the beginnings of the Cold and nuclear wars. And I think definitely paying witness to places that had and still were in war over oil, that the United States had a lot to do with, such as Iraq, really strengthened our resolve to continue to move in that direction. So our values have always been fairly environmental in nature, and it was something we wanted to do. And so when we started looking for land that could be both a small farm and our home to raise our family, some level of solar access was really important to us. So, we started small with small solar electric systems, and then just built them up a little bit more over time as we could. But we still have what would be considered a relatively small series of panels that equal about 3 kilowatts worth of generating capacity, which is really quite small, but, all of the water gets pumped out of a deep well for the farm out of that. Of course, we use a lot less water for irrigation than we would otherwise because of the no-till methods and having everything well mulched with cardboard or covered in silage, tarps, or cover crops. But yeah, our house and the farm are all off the grid using solar, and we feel like we can do everything we need to do. And it's very much aligned with our commitment to, again, doing what we can in some small way as a family to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and all of the environmental destruction and militarism and so forth that is part of that addiction to fossil fuels.
First of all, that is a really elegant and amazing way of looking at being an environmentalist, or adding to your environmentalism as sort of holistic, not just thinking about literally what's in front of you and around you in the woods and those sorts of things, but also like the global effects of our oil purchases and those sorts of things. I think that's there's something really really beautiful about that. But to kind of switch it to a technical question, I was speaking with Stephen Chianchoso, who's a farmer out in Hawaii last year, and he's off grid, and he was kind of talking about some of his big challenges, and I think one was like spinning greens, having enough electricity to have some sort of salad spinner wasn't really an option, so he was spinning them by hand. Are there challenges like that for your system? Is there anything that you're limited by with your off-grid system?
I haven't. Not in terms of the farm. I haven't experienced that. I think you size your solar electric system for what your needs are, and first you have to look at everything and say, what do I really need and why? But then you kind of size it accordingly. I mean, that I wouldn't think that a green salad spinner would be a deciding factor of whether you could use solar or be off the grid or not. And of course, a lot of people are grid intertied, meaning they they use solar, but they're participating in the production of power and still connected to the grid. But no, I really haven't. I mean, and again, we have really a relatively small system. We have a good source of water in a deep artesian well that flows really nicely and is fairly high up in the casing, so pumping it out isn't a massive amount of energy. And, we have our home, we've got a fridge, and we don't have use a microwave and toasters and things that require a lot of energy. But we, use our computers and watch videos as a family and have a electric refrigerator and wash clothes, hang them to dry and all that stuff. So, personally as a homestead, I think it's quite beautiful to be able to really be that connected to the source of your power. And sometimes people will ask, is it a sacrifice? And realize that the root of the word sacrifice is similar to that of the word sacred. So I think being a bit more conscientious about our energy use is a good thing and keeps us more in touch with it. But Rick, would you say I don't think there's been any issues with the farm for lack of electricity?
Our son and I have been watching the Netflix thing, Chernobyl. So I think that's really an important piece. I think, in this culture, we're very privileged and we just don't think about the ramifications. So we just kind of get addicted and but the backstory of everything has a backstory. And, and so I think is how do you clean up your life? And so I think it frees you because, your conscience is a little cleaner because, you see that movie Chernobyl, it's happening. Deb just mentioned something that might happen in Russia recently. So, that's a big part of our energy source in this country. It's nuclear still. There's a lot of people still think it's a transition fuel. So, yeah, I think also just supporting the renewable industry is where it's at.
And if it isn't nuclear, you're from the South, so our, people who are dealing with having to work the coal mines still are suffering because of excess energy use. So, yeah, I think we can all anyone, anywhere, whether it's personally or as we come together in our towns to think about the schools we build or the libraries we build or the YMCA's whatever. There's lots of places where energy can be reduced, but I think especially on small no-till regenerative farms, it's been pretty easy to operate low electricity.
Yeah, that's great, and I relate heavily to the sort of satisfaction of it. My wife and I had an off-grid cabin for about 4 years, and that was really where our farm got going. But we were hauling our water, and we didn't really have any electricity at the time. And there were some difficulties, but there was also a lot of that. It was very deliberate living, and and I pulled a lot of satisfaction out of that. And I think that there is something to be said for the value in that.
And we did that at first also, and didn't have electricity actually when we built the house, so we'd plug our cordless tools into the lighter of the truck, and we had this sort of gravity-fed little bit of water coming out of a culvert, and when it poured at night, Rick would run out and gather as much as he could, those first couple of years. So it's all an evolution, right? And that's what helps us, I think, really appreciate all the moments and all the preciousness of growing a farm.
Yeah. I kind of want to change gears here for a second because I realized that I skipped something that I really do want to hear a little bit more about, and it's how you're integrating cover crops.
Great.
And yeah, maybe you all could just talk about that a little bit.
Well, that's a great one because so basically, when we first got here, it was really, there was no land, really good soil, so it was all about the cardboard method. We got to build land. And so we were covering everything with cardboard, so I didn't really have access to open land. And then I got, then the silage tarps came into our life, and so now that's really opened up a lot for us. So now I could get some gorgeous open land after the tarp comes off, and so I really got into the cover crops, and really had a good experience this year like I mentioned, we grow a lot of native corns, and so usually I love putting the corn, transplant it right into the cardboard. It works wonderful that way. But it's a big area. I'm thinking, it's hard to get cardboard. And I've been loving growing a lot of rye because you can get it in so early. I think the soil could be as low as 35 degrees. So I've been putting a lot of rye in. So I have this gorgeous rye crop. I'm thinking, what do I do? And so basically what I did, how I lay out my lines, I have a piece of rebar on either end of the field with a clothesline, say 100 feet. And I laid a straight line. I put a path maybe a foot wide of compost, maybe a little less, on top of the rye, and then just dibbled right through that. And then basically, while I was planting, it kind of knocked down the rye, so I had a little time, and the corn starts growing nice. All our corn is transplanted in, rather than direct seed. And then I actually just went in there once or twice and weed whacked in between the pathways, but so it's kind of what you would call like a living mulch. And I did the same thing with winter squash with the rye. So the nice thing about it is that, the rye is so tenacious. It really keeps out the weeds. And as a lot of people talk about the crimping, which is wonderful, but as you know, once you kill the cover crop, it doesn't really have much mulching capacity after a certain period of time. And a lot of people are going with putting leaves on top of it, other materials, which is great. But if you can keep it alive, it's there. It's really keep the weeds from coming. So it actually had an incredible. The corn is growing great. The winter squash is growing great. So I really think the idea of a rye living mulch, and as long as your crop can grow above it and you can weed whack it a few times, it's good to go.
And you've got some other cocktails and mixes of cover crops going too, right, Rick?
Yeah, actually, really like the ones that have the daikon radishes, tillage radish, which is interesting because it actually becomes could be a nuisance crop because our fields are now covered with daikons because they really self-seed everywhere. It's not a hard thing to pull out, but it's quite beautiful, is the daikon self-seeding everywhere. But the cover crop cocktails, just planted yesterday, love buckwheat. Bell beans is really another one. Our favorite, I would say, is Sudan grass. Growing 10 to 12 feet tall, and you can cut that and mulch with that. So I would say my favorite is definitely the rye's really working out. Buckwheat, Sudan grass, the bell beans. Yeah, those are probably my favorite.
Hey, you all, one last interruption for me. So we have this idea. We want to start adding video to the podcast. Well, as in, we want to do this podcast as we've been doing it, but additionally, we want to offer some hyper-specific video clips of what guests are doing on their farms, or maybe tools they're using or techniques. So perhaps with an episode like this, we would be able to go see Deb and Ricky and physically be there and record some of this work with their cardboard or a bed flip or something unique they have going on and really get nerdy with it and then share that with you. If that's something you may be interested in, consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/farmerjesse, also linked in the show notes, because this idea would be relatively pricey, not going to lie, and impossible without greater funding. But no one person has to pay for it. $2 a month for some added value like that, $5. I mean, I know personally as a farmer, being able to lay my eyes on some of these things really helps to understand them better and utilize them better. So this is an idea, as all of our ideas, that really help us as full-time farmers. So we'll have some examples of what the heck I'm talking about here soon up at the Patreon page. So that's patreon.com/farmerjesse. Consider signing up. Also, at certain levels of patronage, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Dawson Mahalko, Tiffany Jackson, J.M. Fortier, Ryan Gosser, and Yannick Laplante. Thanks to everyone for your support. All right, back to the show.
With the rye and the compost, you have the rye planted, and then you're knocking it down, and then putting the compost on top, and then plunging.
Well, the rye
dibbling
wasn't very.
Into that.
The rye at this point was more like grass-like, so it wasn't. Very
okay,
tall.
so it wasn't very tall.
No, it wasn't very tall at this point. It was the spring, and so it wasn't very tall. And so, also it's nice. I have a two-wheel wheelbarrow, so actually the wheelbarrow is kind of knocking it down. So it wasn't much to knock it down. And once you put the compost on it, it's done, So it wasn't like a, tall 2-foot crop of rye. No, it was more the grass stage at that point, so it was really easy to work with. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are
But you,
strips of compost.
yes, exactly.
And there's alternating, like a strip of rye, a strip of compost
Right.
that the corn got planted into, a strip of
Right.
rye, strip of compost that the corn.
You know, it's spacing everything maybe 2 feet apart. So each strip is about 2 feet apart. You could even go further if you wanted more of that cover crop growing. I would probably even do further because then it's easier to mow. If you need to mow in between, I would even go probably 3 feet apart. And the beautiful thing about it is that, you know, you have this cover crop growing. So our whole thing is, the goal is to have richer land at the end of the season, you know, and so really you're building soil all the time between having the cover crop growing or having cardboard down. You know, soil's getting richer as the season goes on.
I love that you talked a little bit about just going through and weed whacking down the cover crop a little bit. I often think about this. Sometimes, you know, a cover crop just starts to come back, or maybe I do it on purpose, undersow something, and then maybe I have to deal with it a little bit. And I always think this is so much better than weeding. Like if I'm going to be actively in the garden knocking something back, I appreciate that it's also building soil and it's something that I actually want. I think that's, in some ways, I almost feel like that's something that we neglect to talk about is if we're going to be in there doing some sort of weeding or some sort of cultivation, it's nice to have it be a positive, you know, have a positive effect overall anyway.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, Rick's weed whacker, he's like a real suburban husband these days. It's this heavy-duty powered one, but it is, you know, a big battery that he recharges rather than, you know, on the gas. So, and that, of course, when it gets plugged into anything, it's running off our solar electric system. So
that's great. I love it. The garden's running off solar, and the weed whacker's running off solar. It's awesome.
Anything that needs electricity. Yeah,
exactly. Or energy. So I want to talk a little bit about your book, Making Love While Farming. Can you tell us a little bit about? We've talked about some of the essays that are in it, but can you kind of give us the rundown of what that book is and what people can expect from it?
Sure, yeah, thank you. It's called Making Love While Farming, a field guide to a life of passion and purpose, and it's published by a wonderful worker-owned press called Levelers Press, Levellers Press, not too far from here, in Amherst, Mass., and they've been super to work with. And, we wrote it over about 4 years' time, you know, started thinking about it beforehand. And most of the writing took place in the winter months for obvious reasons. And we have a good friend who's a wonderful writer named Mira Bartok, who's written a number of great books. And we were like, Mira, we want to write this book, but like, how do we even start? And we both like to write in different ways. Ricky more journaling, and I've written more for, you know, our work and our newsletters and things like that, grant applications. And she said, write a bunch of first lines. So we just really started writing a bunch of first lines independently about the, you know, farming and education programs and the pilgrimage we mentioned. And, you know, we wanted the book to be kind of humorous while there were also powerful stories in there. So, you know, as most farmers or most people can relate to, sometimes it's the harder days or the harder times that can make for the best stories. So we wrote a bunch of first lines and then sort of wrote from there and would share our stories with each other and then, you know, organized them all into chapters. And the other piece that felt really important is that that this wasn't just our stories. We really wanted the book to be useful to others, be they farmers or young farmers or, you know, or artists or chefs or, you know, just really anyone trying to figure out how to put their values into action and live a life that was felt meaningful to them and fulfilling and largely how to keep, you know, your relationships with your partner, with your kids, with your friends, with your customers, whoever it is, healthy. Because I think, you know, unfortunately, that's a hard thing to do, and it's a hard thing to do as farmers. So we wrote it and we rewrote it and we shared it with folks to get feedback, and it was a 4-year process, and it came out in April, and we're getting great feedback on it, and we're getting, you know, feedback from lots of folks that are not farmers who just feel kind of moved by the stories within, and and I think are in some ways, affirmed to keep doing the small good work we can in our lives and communities, and try and be loving people, and take risks for the things we believe in, and think outside the box, and carry on. We've also heard from folks that it's, really a great accessible text for people who might teach like farm and food systems classes or sustainability classes at colleges and universities, because I think young folks are looking for, looking for models, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from those in our past, as Ricky and I have, and then recreate, what works for us out of those stories and experiences.
I kind of want to, in every episode, kind of talk about some of the, something that you've maybe tried that didn't work. And, I think that we learn a lot from other people's successes, but sometimes at least as much, if not more so, from things that didn't work. So I'm curious if there's anything that stands out, especially in regards to no-till agriculture, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, you just talked about balancing your, life and farming and those sorts of things like you wrote about in your book. Any of that, I would be interested.
Thanks for asking. Rick, do you have something that comes to mind?
That's a great question. I think one thing we did try that we often joke about was called Solidarity Blooms. It was a subscription flower business, which would have worked great if we were more in the city, but we ended up schlepping buckets of flowers around all over the place. So we joke about it. We weren't that attached to it that we were really too depressed when it was over. But it was fun, but we, it just didn't work because we were just going all over the place. But that was definitely one that, yeah.
Right. So that's true. What else? I'm trying to think. Any of the particular farming techniques, Ricky, that I would say, I don't know if it's a technique necessarily, but for about 10 years, we had, a pretty active apprenticeship program. We're really committed to teaching folks. So we've probably had, maybe 20 to 30 pretty serious farm apprentices over the years, and then that number again interning with our education programs. And, there's one chapter in our book called, there's two. One is the Apprentices from Hell, and the other is sorry, I can't finish the season. I'm in jail or something like that. And both of those have to deal with just kind of apprentice situations, kind of gone bad, and one was we actually hadn't met the apprentices before they came. They lived in the Midwest, and we took a chance and went with the reference, and it just ended up not being a good match at all. So I think, and we're not, we consider ourselves pretty easy people to get along with and pretty flexible. But I think that trying to run a farm and teach folks at the same time can be really beautiful, and it can also be challenging at times. So we've definitely had way more wonderful experiences and relationships than hard ones, but there's been a couple tough ones, right? Because you have to live together and deal with all the emotional issues that folks bring, and also actually run a farm and get work done. But I think lots of farmers can probably relate to that. So is there another technique thing, Rick, you can think of?
That's pretty good.
I kind of want to, let's just stick with that for a second, because I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you've learned, or what you did learn with the apprentice thing. Do you have advice in that regard in terms of running a good apprenticeship program?
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that, Ricky?
Well, you could definitely speak to that, but what's interesting, where I'm at right now is basically what happened was I realized, when the apprentices are gone, for the day or something, it's like, I'm doing it. It's like, wow, I'm farming. It's like, I like this. It's like you end up, as you end up managing, and that's the worst part, and they never do a job like you wanted to get done. And so that's really how the no-till really took off for me. It's like, how can I grow enough food to sell and all that by myself? And so that's the beautiful thing about no-till. You're spending all this time tilling. And so in terms of labor saving, these techniques have allowed me to grow a lot of food by myself. It's so difficult to find labor out there. And now basically my best help, I have a group of women that come out every Monday morning to help women over 50. So that's my thing.
And I think people need to know that with apprentices or interns, you really need to be committed to it as an educational process. And we were, for many years and still are and still do have occasional interns, but we kind of did that intensively for a couple decades because you're gonna often kind of give as much as you're gonna get sometimes, and if it's a good relationship for everyone. So you kind of have to be committed to that as a process. I think also, you will never get to know someone just through conversation and pieces of paper that describe experiences. So I'd say certainly with any farm apprentice position, have work together, have them work with you for a day before you actually take them on as an apprentice. And a day isn't that long, but you can actually see a lot in a day. You can all decide, especially the farmer can decide, does this person, how do we groove together, and do they pick up on tasks quickly? Are they efficient with their time? Are they just talking the whole time and not working? Are they working and talking at the same time? All that stuff, yeah.
We came up with the Ernest Shackleton interview process, the famous explorer there. Put them in the hard situation. I think that's key. One time it came out we were putting up a greenhouse in a snowstorm. So I think that's really how you're going to find out what anyone could anyone could sit in front, have a cup of tea and say all the right things, and especially, hate to say it, a lot of the young folks have all the right words, but work ethic is not necessarily where it's at. So yeah, that's like I said, the women over 50. There's no BS, no drama. They have nothing to prove. And actually, one of the women has started up her own little farm stand and is doing it and continuing to come every week because, our relationship grows, as her experience grows. But, yeah, Ernest Shackleton interview process is key.
It's funny because I think about what you were just saying in terms of needing to be there for a day and work. And that was something that I apprenticed on the same farm for 2 years, and they required that you came and worked for a day. And I was living in New York City when I applied, and he was like, great, it sounds great. We'd love to have you come for an interview. So I did. I flew down there and did the interview and spent the day with them working. And I think we moved hay. And then I, had dinner with them, and I ended up getting the internship. And it was funny because they said that was like key, that they'd been burned by so many people that they like, even though on paper, right, I'm calling from New York City, I'm really excited about leaving the city and getting into learning where my food came from, and I'm really interested in biodynamics at the time, and they were doing all of the things that I was interested in, and I was, of course, like you said, saying all the right things, but then I still had to come prove myself, and I'm glad I did. They're still our mentors, and it was a great experience for my wife and I, whom I met there.
Perfect.
Yeah, it was perfect. And
like you said, it's important for the apprentices too, because there's lots of different types of farm and farmer styles, and you want to make sure if you're going to put that much energy in day after day, that it's the people you want to be with and the styles that you want to be learning from. It's so important.
Yeah, I don't know if you all ever read Joel Salatin's Fields of Farmers, but he kind of dives deep into that. We
read other of his books. I don't think I read that one.
I recommend it to the listenership for anyone who's interested in being an apprentice or having an apprentice program.
Right. The other thing, Gussie, I think about that we move towards, and this relates to this whole conversation, and it also relates to our book is stories about our farming, farm practices, the education programs, and I mentioned the field guide section that has sort of nuts and bolts stuff, but it was also really important to us to build in contemplative practices throughout the book as well, because I think as things went along for us, both as farmers and running the organization and also running this big festival, mostly as volunteers that we hadn't talked that much about, and having a family, just needing to really think about ways to keep ourselves kind of centered and keep our relationship centered and strong. So I'd say that became increasingly important as we went along, and I know that a lot of folks say, "Oh, I don't have time, I don't have time, I don't have time." But it's like we have to make the time. You know, if you're gonna keep farming for the long haul, and if you're going to be a person that other people want to be around, as a farmer, if you want to keep your relationship strong, you know, we have to make time for whatever it is that that feeds our soul and feeds our spirit. And so, you know, in our book as well, we've shared some of the ways that we do that individually and as a couple, but you know, not in a dogmatic way, but more through some practices and exercises with hope that some will resonate for others and they'll be able to build those into their lives, so we can keep this work going, because we've got to keep growing food, and we have to keep our community strong, and we have to keep the love strong and stronger in these times, and you know, need to keep renourishing ourselves in some way in order to do that.
I love that, and I love that it's. I think that all of that is absolutely important to farming in terms of being a sustainable or even regenerative farmer. It is about the nuts and bolts, but it is also about the relationships and how you feel about, you know, yourself and your goals and your partner and how you're getting along and all of those things. I think all of that is so critical. Deb and Ricky, I really appreciate you all have given us some time and sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just been a pleasure speaking with you, and our warmth goes out to everyone listening to this. And if there's something you listeners take from this podcast that helps you grow good food everywhere for yourselves and communities, then that's a beautiful thing. So thank you.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to check out Deb and Ricky's book, Making Love While Farming. I will link that in the show notes. Also, check out their Instagram under the same name, Making Love While Farming, and you can also read more about their work in Andrew Mefford's book, Organic No-Till Farming Revolution. Great book. You should own it. Also, make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it. Make sure to share it with some friends. That helps us a lot. If you like this podcast, let people know about it. Shout it from the rooftops. I don't know how your neighbors feel about that. Maybe they won't even hear you. Maybe just shout it from the internet. Also, be sure to check out patreon.com/farmerjesse. Like I said, we want to start adding some video to these things. That's patreon.com/farmerjesse, Jesse. Yeah, I think video would be a really cool addition to what we're already doing. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. Kick in a couple bucks. I know you've been meaning to. It's a good opportunity. And don't forget the event at Jared's Real Food in San Diego. That is under the events tab at no-tillgrowers.com. So go to no-tillgrowers.com, hit the events tab, and you're there. All right, that's it for me. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
The piece that we talk a lot about that we didn't really get into, but running out of time, but just the sacredness of no-till, and I think that's really important. I think, before organic was taken by the USDA, I think that grassroots movement had a lot of spirit and a lot of soul, and that's been taken. And I think it's really important that we incorporate, spirit and sacredness into our farming practices and a real reverence for the soil. I think that's critical. Taking care of ourselves, taking care of the soil, but a real honoring of the soil is critical, because I think, unfortunately, it has just become, business, and that's just not where it's going to keep us going.
I think that's really interesting, because I always think about kind of what you were talking about earlier when there's this sort of, even with organic farmers, this sort of like mentality of sort of forcing the soil to do what you want it to, and then instead of asking the soil what it needs. And it doesn't, obviously it doesn't have to be literal, but that's what we're doing as no-till farmers. We're looking at it and saying, what can we do to make sure that you're photosynthesizing and you're maximizing that photosynthesis and you're getting all the nutrients you need. And it is a kind of different mentality, but it's an important one.
And basically we still even have soil today, because all our ancestors for thousands of years actually honored the soil. And, let's face it, the greatest natural disaster ever, human disaster, is the Dust Bowl. that unreverence of like, we're just going to till this land up, and and we haven't really changed our methods all that much. So I think really the whole no-till is a real revolution in terms of going in a direction that's healthier all the way around.